Okay, there we go. Awesome. Good deal. Alrighty then. So just to go ahead and jump into what Legislative Day is going to be covering today. Today's topics, we're going to be looking into mental health accessibility, test optionals, and state scholarship statistics, as well as need-based aid and current legislation that we're facing here in South Carolina itself. But to jump really, really quickly, I do want to go ahead and introduce our panelists as well as my co-chair. Fred, do you want to take it from here? Oh, oh. I don't want to leave you out. I don't want to leave you out.
Thank you so much, Kim. No, I'm happy to be aboard. This is my first year serving as co-chair with Kim, who's obviously a rock star at this. I'm just excited to be a part of the journey, and I'm excited you all are joining us today so we can learn a lot about the things that are happening here in the state of South Carolina as relates to education and higher ed.
Absolutely. And our panelists that we have today are going to be Jess Hudgens. She is the Winthrop University Counseling Outreach Coordinator, speaking on our section regarding mental health. We also have David Hawkins. He is the Chief Education and Policy Officer for NACAC, which is the National Association for Admissions Counseling, College Admissions Counseling, excuse me. And then South Carolina Senator Mike Fanning, a part of District 17 for Chesterfield, Fairfield, and York counties as well. And then as your moderators, you do have myself, Kim Foster. I'm a regional admissions counselor at Winthrop University. And then Fred, as he introduced himself as well, as the Associate Director of Admissions and Recruitment at the Citadel. Awesome, awesome. So, well, we'll go ahead and jump straight into it and get started. So, really quickly as well, for those who are, not new to Zoom, I'm sure everyone is at this point, but just some quick etiquette. We would love for you to turn your cameras on if you wish to do so, but you're not required to, but we love to see your faces. Microphones, we do ask that they do stay on mute during the duration of the presentation because we're going to be opening the floor out for questions at the end, which you'll be able to utilize the chat box to do so as well. And then for your names, if you could please change them to your full name, so that way it's a bit easier to identify you. It'd be greatly appreciated. Alrighty then. So we'll go ahead and jump straight into it. Jess, are you ready?
As I'll ever be.
Okay. Alrighty then. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. So that way, if you want to go ahead and share yours.
Awesome. And we will jump in here. Oops. All right. So I always like, before kind of looking at solutions, to kind of give us a full scope of the problem. I always forget to introduce myself. I'm Jess. I'm a licensed counselor. I work at the university. I see students as well as working on outreach and working with student groups and other departments on campus to do so. So there is a national group called the Center for Collegiate Mental Health that does large scale surveys every year. And kind of aggregates all of the data from different counseling and psychological services centers at universities across the nation. And since 2019, there has been a 30 to 40% increase in the usage of mental health services on college campuses. In that same period, the actual enrollment in college has only increased about 5%. So we're seeing the mental health needs and utilization far outstrip kind of the way that the enrollment as a whole is growing, which really is pretty consistent with the way that we're seeing mental health needs for young adults across the state and across the nation grow increasingly. So suicide continues to be the second leading cause of death for folks 15 to 24, and among college students nationally. In South Carolina, we have a higher suicide rate per 100,000 than nationally, considerably so. In 2019, which was even pre-pandemic, right, almost 4% of young adults in college age had made a plan for suicide, and about half of those had actually gone through with an attempt, which is not insignificant when you consider the number of 18 to 25 years old. So that's pre-pandemic, right? Tons of research since that kind of indicates COVID and isolation and quarantine and all of the stresses of that really didn't do a lot of favors for the mental health of the nation as a whole, and for our youth in particular, especially as they were pulled apart from their social groups. So it is to the point that the American Academy of Pediatrics, along with the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, actually declared it a national state of emergency in children's mental health in the past few months, because the rates of depression, anxiety, trauma, loneliness, and actual visits to ERs from children and young adults for suicidal ideation have risen so significantly, and far beyond what we would expect, just kind of as general like population growth. So when we look at kind of the reasons for increased utilization, I think that's important to recognize as well, because there are a lot of factors that go into it. And so when we look at solutions, it's not just, oh yeah, throw some more counselors at it, right? We have to really know what's happening to create this. Our students are a lot more aware of mental health, more aware of what kind of things are and how to talk about it, but they don't necessarily have the skills to deal with it, right? So when COVID hit and everything had to shift to telehealth, that all of a sudden made it easier in some ways to get counseling. So you didn't have to drive to an appointment. Awesome. That also assumed that you had a safe and private space that you could have that appointment. But because of the increased access, the way that everybody was so stressed out, and kind of some of the national conversations happening, right? There was an increase in help seeking, which is awesome. It's also important to note, right, that 3/4 of mental illnesses start showing symptoms by age 24. So this is a really peak period of onset. And a lot of times, college is the first opportunity that students have to seek access to mental health care. They may have a counselor, a guidance counselor, a social worker at the high school level or middle school, but if they're a minor, their parents have access to that, right? Like their counselor is duty bound to talk to their parents if something's going on. Once they're 18 and they're here, that's not the same. This is really their healthcare, and so that feels a lot safer, especially from folks who are coming from unsafe backgrounds. You know, the fact that it's right here, right, like across from the place where they go and hang out and grab food with their friends, it's so much closer, is another thing to consider. That access piece isn't necessarily a consideration. They might be away from home and they don't have to deal with the family messages, right? It's not going through insurance. They don't have to worry about co-pays, all of these things. And we're seeing pretty consistent things in terms of why they come here. If you look at the presenting concerns at Winthrop, pretty consistently anxiety, always. Pretty much always our number one, right? Depression, almost 20% of appointments. Some sort of trauma is almost 10%. There are, I think it's almost 17% of South Carolina children 0 to 17 have at least 2 adverse childhood experiences, which adverse childhood experience is a survey that was created to kind of look at childhood outcomes and childhood experiences, and the adverse experiences are those of neglect, abuse, abandonment, right? Like trauma and instability. And so we're seeing those students show up in our office because this is the first time they've had the opportunity to do so, right? Eating disorders, which is my specialty area, so I kind of threw that in there. They blew up during COVID with the isolation and some of the insecurity. And then you look at the additional stresses that college creates, right? The transition, navigating new situations, meeting new people, living on their own. I got to figure out how to do laundry, right? If a student already has a mental health concern or a mental illness, it's going to exacerbate that if they don't know how to handle it. So we are seeing students here at university who in previous years may not have made it to university, right? Because there are such improvements in medication. There are such improvements in early screening and identification of different diagnoses, right, and different conditions that we have a number of students who have autism spectrum, who are on the autism spectrum. And so these autistic students may not have previously made it to a four-year college, and yet they're here. And so now they're struggling with some of the social aspects, which makes sense based on how their brains operate, and maybe not something we would have seen 15 years ago, right? Same with some of the schizoaffective disorders, that sort of thing. Bipolar disorder, pretty well managed with medication, and yet pretty easy to throw off with some of those stressors. Also important to look at the cost of college as a major stressor. The external stressors that exist for college students today are very different. The cost of college alone, right? Since 1980, the cost of a college degree has increased by 169%. That is far beyond the pace of inflation, right? So the average student, right, and which takes into account every student who's taken out loans, the average student gets a four-year degree with $37,000 in student debt, which is significant. And that's not private debt, right? Like that is generally the kind of public figure. If that is federal student loans, if you have to take out private loans, that's a whole other story. I'm in a unique position in that I went to Winthrop and graduated from here. And so now I'm back here and working here. And so I have this unique perspective on kind of going, okay, so like I was here not that long ago, right? Like maybe 15 years ago. I didn't even have $10,000 in student debt when I graduated. And it's not because I had like a full ride, right? Or because I piecemealed some scholarships here and there after I applied late, right? But I also wasn't having to work a ridiculous number of hours. I am seeing students come in and working 30 plus hours a week, taking a full course load of 15 or 18 hours, doing extracurricular activities, right? Trying to manage all of that. And so that creates an incredible amount of stress that then they're trying to figure out, how do I deal with this? I don't have the skills. And so that is frequently cited as a concern, right? I have talked so many students through anxiety about finances and kind of tried to work with them of like, how do we do these things, right? Like, how do we kind of put that anxiety to the side so that you can focus on your academics? And that's if they make it to the session, right? If they follow up, because when you're working 30 hours a week and you're in the classroom another 15 or 20, there's not a whole lot of time for counseling. That it's really hard to do, right? And so then you look at ongoing, these students may not even make it past their freshman year. Looking at the most recent cohort that we have data with, which I think is maybe fall 2019, 2020. There's data for like the Pell recipients at Winthrop, right? 63.1% return for their second year. That's compared to the students who aren't Pell recipients, right? Not low income, 70.5%. So it's not a huge gap, but that's a pretty significant gap, right? Like if you are not having to kind of manage those additional financial stressors, and then that gap just grows wider and wider and wider the further down those 4 years you go, right? The stresses just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. And so by the time you get to 4 years, not barely 44% have graduated if they're Pell recipients, and it's 58%, right, if they're non-Pell recipients. So those financial stressors are considerable and just kind of build over the course of 4 years, because they are highly aware of, they've got that kind of ticking rolling tab in their head of how much student loans do I have, right? I think the other thing to consider, right, South Carolina as a state, right, just really isn't equipped to handle the load. When you look at South Carolina compared to other states in the nation, we don't have as many mental health providers. This image on the left is showing a comparison between per 100,000 population, right? How many mental health care providers are there? That's psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, counselors, marriage and family therapists, advanced nurse practitioners, substance abuse. In the US, per 100,000 people, you have an average of 284 providers. In South Carolina, it's 193. On the right-hand side, that is a map of South Carolina from 2 months ago, 2.5 months ago, of the mental health professional shortage areas. There are 3.5 counties in South Carolina that don't qualify as having a mental health professional shortage area. So even if students were willing to go off campus or able to go off campus, right, if they had the finances, there aren't a whole lot of options for them. Trying to find a psychiatrist to refer students to is super difficult. And then if you have a very specialized situation, if you have a student with a dissociative disorder, trying to find somebody who's specialized in that is near impossible, right? Trying to find psychiatrists or a medical provider who's specialized in eating disorders, right? Super difficult. So South Carolina just generally isn't prepared for the mental health needs of the students here. And we can't kind of rely on the universities to handle it all, because university counselors, like all counselors across the nation over the past couple of years, have been like hitting the road. Like, what else can I do, right? Like the number of articles and kind of research studies, the burnout level is very high among college counselors, in part because we're committed to the work. We do it because we really care. And it is tough work. And nobody goes into the job for the money, right? Like in mental health in general, nobody goes into the job for the money. So it is one of those things that, you know, the accumulated stress of trying to provide stability in mental health care for folks during COVID, while also trying to figure out how to deal with COVID, right? Like in our own lives, like that has been the kind of constant battle for providers. And so it's very possible that this map might have looked a little different a few years ago for South Carolina. And with folks kind of jumping ship and wanting to do something different, now we're seeing an even greater shortage. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so when we talk about improving access, right? Telehealth is amazing. I don't love doing telehealth. I'd much rather work in person if I could. But there's real advantage to it, right? For folks who are sick, right? Who have chronic illness, who have mobility issues, they can get to sessions where they might not have been able to before. I can send a student to see a psychiatrist in Charleston who maybe specializes in what they need, because somebody in Rock Hill doesn't, right? But we need to increase, right, that access to telehealth, which means ensuring ongoing coverage. You know, there's kind of this like constant conversation of like, are they going to pull the coverage for telehealth among counselors? Are they going to reimburse it at the same rate? I don't want to do telehealth if they're not going to reimburse it the same way as in person. And so making sure that that's a possibility. Joining the Interstate Counseling Compact, right? There are interstate compacts for medical providers, for different prescribers, right? There's one for counseling. The 9th and 10th states just signed, right? So it's active. So if South Carolina can create legislation around that and pass it and join that, all of a sudden that opens the door to 10 other states with providers, right? So if there is not somebody here in South Carolina who has that specialty and the student is appropriate for telehealth, sure, they can see somebody in Tennessee, they can see somebody in Florida, right? So working across those state lines. expanding access to mental health supports in K-12 and in university settings, right? Really looking at, are there ways to build into the curriculum the emotional literacy and skills for mental wellness from the outset, right? From the very beginning. I think it's really important to note that, right, kids who are coming into college today have never lived in a pre-Columbine world. They have always grown up with the fear of school shootings. That, when I think of my school years, especially younger school years, it was like, oh, tornado drill, right? Like nuclear drill, because I was next to Duke Power. Active shooter drill, what was that, right? Like, these kids are growing up watching the news, seeing first graders gunned down in their classrooms, right? And doing active shooter drills on the regular. So they have internalized this lack of safety at school. And so being able at school to provide them the tools to feel safe and to regulate themselves and to kind of be able to connect to what's happening inside themselves and feel calmer is really important, right? Again, nearly 17% of South Carolina children have 2 or more adverse childhood experiences, right? That increases their risk of poor outcomes in the future, whether that's drug abuse, eating disorders, severe and persistent mental illness, chronic health issues, early death, right? Like, all of those things have these correlations to adverse childhood experiences. And then just increasing availability in schools at all levels by recruiting and retaining the mental health professionals. I think the retaining is maybe part of the hardest at this point. And so some of that is this next point of incentivizing the choice to work in mental health. That could look like a number of things, right? Is it scholarships? Is it loan repayment programs for students who are working in low access communities and ensuring that we have got a number of different options for that? Does it look like state-funded grant programs for underrepresented groups, right? Because access to mental health care doesn't just mean access to more white women counselors, which is what largely the counseling field looks like, right? But there's something really powerful about having a counselor that looks like you. And so being able to ensure that our students see somebody that looks like them and maybe share some life experience, and that those students who maybe would like to go to graduate school aren't held back by their own circumstances, right? Counseling is expensive to go into. I can't even imagine psychiatry and psychology and things like that, where you have to get even further advanced degrees. Most of my student debt is just from graduate school, from 2 years. So if I came from different circumstances, I may not have felt comfortable taking out those loans, right? It wouldn't have been a possibility. So being able to ensure that students feel safe doing that, because there's a plan moving forward for how they can not be in debt until they retire. And then I would say fully funding the 988 suicide hotline, right? Making sure that wherever somebody is in the state, in the nation, they know who they can call if they feel unsafe, right? If they need help. I happen to have the National Lifeline number, right, memorized at this point because I've said it so many times, right? I can write it down. I can write down the crisis text line number. Students don't have that memorized. They're they got too many things kind of jumbled in their head at this point. 988, well, it's kind of like 911. Okay, that's doable, right? So if we can ensure that that is funded and there is somebody in the state of South Carolina answering that, so that when our South Carolina students call that, they are connected to somebody who can then make sure that they are routed to resources near them, that'll be really powerful in terms of preventing potentially fatal outcomes. So that, I think, those are some ideas for potentially improving some access to mental health care and making sure that our students are cared for moving forward. And some references, if anybody is interested in them, I will drop my email in the chat box so that you guys can email me if you want the references.
That was absolutely amazing, Jess. Oh my goodness. I wish I could give you like a full round of applause because that was some amazing information. I didn't realize the cost of tuition inflation by itself up by 169% since the 1980s, and the rates of students and statistics that are having increased levels of anxiety, increased levels of depression. These are all amazing reasons as to why we advocate for our students, as to why we push for them to be able to be in a happy and safe environment. So thank you so much for that information. That is incredible. And I hope our audience definitely took a lot away from that. I know I certainly did. So we're going to continue on. And also she has put her email address in the chat as well, just in case if anyone does have any additional questions in the upcoming future, especially after this session. But we're going to go ahead and continue on. David, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am. Let me take a moment to share my screen. There we go, and share. Can everyone see this presentation? Excellent, excellent. Well, Jess, I want to relate to your opening observation about introductions. I am famous or infamous for racing into presentations without saying a little bit about the people in the room or even myself. But I've been at NACAC for 22 years now and have been doing advocacy for all of them. So appreciate this opportunity. Thank you to the folks at SACAC for doing this. First of all, your time when you have a full-time job, when you stop to advocate is very much appreciated. I know what it takes to volunteer. It's not an easy job, and really appreciate what you're doing. So also, just before I do a brief presentation about standardized testing and its relationship to some of the other policy issues that we'll be considering, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the fiscal year 2023 budget proposal at the federal level from the Biden administration includes a $1 billion proposal to hire school-based mental health professionals. So in addition to the professional counseling community and the shortages that Jess mentioned, there are parallel shortages in the schools. And of course, we know this as advocates for school counselors, but we are very excited about this proposal. It is the largest increase the largest proposal for mental health professionals in schools that I think it's ever been proposed. So it's very exciting time to be here, and we as NACAC are supportive of the administration's proposal. So on to speaking of mental health and poor mental health and standardized testing, this is something that we actually, all kidding aside, we hear quite a bit about. I think before I go into my slides, the main idea for today's presentation is to help set the stage for how we as NACAC at the federal level, but also at the state level, want to be talking to policymakers right now about standardized testing. Frankly, we are in a state of a little bit of change that well, not a little bit, a lot of change, but the result of that is that we are acting on incomplete information. But what we want to do is we want to tell policymakers what we do know about standardized testing, and then what kinds of things are still in progress. The change that happened due to the pandemic created a lot of almost laboratory conditions where you have colleges that had required tests for a very long time. Now they're not requiring them for at least a 2 to 4 year period. Some of them may be going on to do to be permanently test optional. But we have this moment in time where we can collect a lot of information about how test optional works. And so we're in the process of doing that, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So the idea for legislators is that it's important to note that we are a profession that is very much wrestling with this issue right now. And we don't want policymakers to rush into policies to bring tests back before we have a chance to really see how this works. Just as we don't want people rushing into really anything when it comes to admissions, particularly when we talk about equity, because we want to understand all of the implications so that we don't resume the kind of conditions we had before the pandemic, which were already problematic on an equity front. We've seen improvements, and we don't want to lose that ground. So that's the big picture as we go into some of this data. Prior to the pandemic, there were about 1,100 colleges that were test optional in some way. And of course, you all are familiar with the many different ways you can define test optional, including test free, which means colleges don't even consider tests at all. Post-pandemic, that number went up to 1,800 colleges. So it's a pretty big jump there. And I think that's important because, again, we have potentially a lot of data to look at. And I don't know if you saw PBS NewsHour on Wednesday night. I didn't actually see it live, but I watched the next day, and they went to Emory University and showed how test optional has changed the incoming class at Emory just in 1 year. And it's an amazing story to watch. The students they feature are incredible. So if you have a chance, go and check it out. But so colleges like Emory that may never have gone test optional had it not been for the pandemic are now in a position to see what this does. So, and again, not necessarily advocating for test optional, but just being able to see how it works. Then they can make a decision. Well, does this work for us? Does it achieve the things we want it to do? If so, maybe we continue doing it. At this point, according to Fair Test, there are 28 test optional colleges in South Carolina. So probably the large majority of the institutions there remain test optional. Though I did see that the state system was looking to go, had defined its test optional period through 2023. And I guess the decision will be made beyond that. When we think about the future, Inside Higher Ed actually did a survey late last year, I want to say, or early this year. Sorry, I forgot the date right in front of me. And they found that the colleges that went test optional as a result of the pandemic, roughly 2/3 of them indicated that they were likely to stay test optional permanently. So we're talking about a pretty big groundswell here when it comes to individual colleges across the country. Meanwhile, at the state level, we're seeing some states deciding that this is the way of the future, that this is how we want to do it. We've seen some states declare that they will be test optional throughout their system indefinitely. We've also seen states like Colorado that have implemented policies that give their state institutions permission to be test optional, so they don't dictate a statewide policy. And we've seen yet other states like Georgia and Florida decide we're going test required. So it's a mix around the country of different approaches to this. And indeed, we've seen legislation introduced all over the country, both requiring tests and saying that colleges should go test optional. And the interesting thing about this for advocates is that I say unfortunately because this really isn't and shouldn't be a partisan issue. It looks like progressives are lining up behind more test optional policies, and the conservatives are lining up behind the more traditional test required policies. We as NACAC want to try to keep this in the realm of sharing facts and information with folks so that they can make the decisions that they need. But we definitely don't want, particularly test required policies to be enacted just because that's the way it's always been. That's really not a recipe for success. If you are going to require tests, you really should have a good reason to do so. So as we look into the test optional future, we also want to focus on equity considerations. Before the pandemic, we were actually involved in 2 studies that looked at test optional admissions and tried to figure out, are there really any differences between test required schools and test optional schools, or schools that might be test optional and where submitters and non-submitters had significant differences. And a 2014 study found that actually across 23 different institutions, there were no statistical differences between test submitters and non-submitters when it came to outcomes like GPA, graduation, and persistence rates. So the idea here is that and these were 23 institutions that looked at years worth of data on their student outcomes. And they were different levels of selectivity. They were big state institutions, smaller privates, all sorts of different institutions in the mix. The bottom line is the students that didn't submit their test scores did just as well as the students who did submit their test scores. A follow-up study suggested that when we looked more specifically at the admissions and financial aid process, that at least in terms of the admissions returns, that there were improvements in equity in the application and enrollment phases. So test optional admission did seem to exert an influence towards more or greater equity in terms of the larger numbers of students who were both applying and enrolling in test optional institutions from underrepresented backgrounds. So, and this was pre-pandemic. So these were important. This is an important groundwork to lay and to consider. Indeed, some of the early returns, I mentioned Emory University just a minute ago, and there was a study from University of Missouri just last week, I believe, that really affirmed both of the pre-pandemic studies, that students were applying and enrolling in higher rates from the underrepresented populations, and they were doing just as well in terms of performance while they were in school. So really important sort of stage to set to make sure that policymakers don't perceive that there's some sort of dramatic difference between a group of students who does submit scores and those who don't. It's a position that's not borne out by the research. That said, as we look forward, we know, in fact, a report that we issued in 2020 based on a testing commission that we convened, we know that test optional by itself is not the answer. There have to be a large number of other elements in place, including more inclusive recruitment policies, student supports on campus, ranging from mental health to academic support to basic needs. All of the different things have to be in place to ensure that we realize fully the equity gains that we might achieve using test optional as perhaps one of many tools. And then a 2022 report that we issued with our colleagues at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators suggested that really, because standardized tests represent a bit of a detour from the academic path that students are normally on, it involves a lot of extracurricular activity, whether it's test prep, whether it's money you have to pay, whether it's time you have to spend, that every step you take away from the school, you take a step away from equity. And so what we really want to encourage is that states and institutions look at the test requirement from the perspective of, is what we get out of these tests, which is quite minimal when compared to high school GPA, what is it worth all of the work that students and families have to do, the costs that our high schools have to bear to implement these tests, just to get that tiny little return, and with a tool that has proven and very concerning equity problems. So that's something that we really want to think about as we go forward. And fortunately for us, we were chosen by the Gates Foundation to lead a partnership where we're going to, actually researchers at the University of Maryland are going to conduct a large-scale research study to find out what colleges are learning about equity returns of test optional policies. Because as I said earlier, while we're in this almost laboratory condition, we really want to reach out to colleges and find out, how's this working? What are you doing? What kinds of things are you doing? What are the returns that you're seeing? Are you in fact improving your equity outcomes? And that will hopefully enable us to speak with even more authority as we move forward as to what the implications, the longer term implications of these policies are. Now, there was the question, how is this going to affect aid? Because we all know, everybody's familiar with testing in admissions. And of course, there are state policies that require tests, institutional policies for admission. Not as many people realize that there are quite a few financial aid implications here. In 2021, for the first time, institutional aid actually accounted for more than half of all aid that was given to students at $71.1 billion. Part of the reason for that was that the federal emergency aid that came out as a result of COVID really helped fill the coffers of need-based aid from the institutional perspective. So there was a lot more to give thanks to the federal government in that case. But the big implication that has is that a lot of institutions, and I'll say not with respect to the COVID money, but as you move forward, a lot of institutions do have policies related to their financial aid programs, as well as states, that have some minimum test score requirements in them. So as we move forward, we just came out of a period where we were, I don't want to say flush, but we had a lot more money injected into the system, and it helped a lot of students, with the caveat in that third bullet there that we had about 250,000 fewer students who filed to FAFSA, and indeed we are seeing some sort of dropping out of the pipeline at the low income levels. But as we move into the future, the reason all of that together is a little bit troubling is that there isn't going to be that much federal money as there was in these relief bills. So there is going to be a little bit of a contraction of the federal financial aid pot, and we need to make sure that as we're looking at our state policies, how are we going to make sure that we don't backslide on these equity gains that we've made? How are we going to ensure that more low-income students are not going to fall out of the pipeline? And part of that consideration has to do with test optional admissions. I'll mention on the next slide some data about the number of states that have test requirements for their financial aid programs at the state level. But that's the 2018 study I mentioned a minute ago indicated that one of the areas where test optional didn't really help underrepresented and underserved students was that test non-submitters at test optional institutions were less likely to receive gift aid from the institution, which means either that they were being filtered out of policies that required a test score, or there was something about the way in which those aid funds were disseminated that somehow favored test submitters over non-submitters. And so there's a lot more research that needs to be done on that. And again, the Gates project that I mentioned a minute ago is going to look into that to ensure that we understand how these policies are affecting financial aid audiences. 15 states have financial aid programs that require minimum SAT or ACT scores, including South Carolina, as you all well know. And then, of course, many institutions have institutional aid programs. So again, we really want to focus on what the policy implication is here. And down at the bottom, you see that really all states with any academic requirement for their financial aid programs include the high school GPA, because you're not, good practice dictates you can't do just a single criteria that is based on test scores only. But most of the states that have an academic requirement use high school GPA without the test scores. So it's really just the 15 that have the test scores. And I think that the policy, what's relatively easy in terms of a policy fix to ensure that sort of a resumption in testing, or when you're considering resuming tests, one of the main arguments that you can make is just that, look, there's a whole bunch of other states that do this without the tests, and they seem to do just fine. So it's something that I think we have to think very carefully about. And we want to make sure we're not backsliding on our equity gains. So again, this is just a little bit of a summary, and then I'll wrap up so we can get to the star of the show. State and institutional policy, we really recommend that you give serious consideration to reducing or eliminating your test score requirements in admissions and financial aid. That's going to be a state by state and institution by institution decision. But it's something that we recommend that you consider very carefully, given the equity implications and given what we know about the fact that many colleges now can operate test optional and do just fine. And then finally, we really want to ensure that regardless of what policy we choose, the commitment to researching, to asking the tough questions, and to maintaining a focus on equity is 100% necessary to meet the needs of a modern university, which has to serve an increasingly diverse and global population. So that is the end of the test prep section. And any more information that you need, I definitely post a lot out to the NACAC Wonk, so I hope you'll give a follow on Twitter if you're not already, but I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That is some great information. I know a quote that always come to mind whenever I'm thinking about standardized testing, and Megan has heard me say this a couple of times now, is that if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it'll go its whole life thinking that it's stupid. So, it's kind of relates to standardized testing just in that example of every student is different, and accessibility for all students is extremely, extremely important. So, alrighty then. Now, drum roll, please, everyone. Just kidding. Alrighty then. Well, we have our, thank you, Fred. We have our South Carolina Senator Mike Fanning, who is going to be presenting some additional information for you all. Now, Mike, I did have the presentation slides that we used last year, if you wanted me to put that up on the slide. Otherwise, you are more than welcome to take it away.
I will just roll. We just came off the floor passing a budget, And so I do have some updates to share. I wish mine were as much good news as some of the others would share, but I will share a few things. Before I get to the presentation, I do want to mention several things. I loved your test discussion. Every year I've been here, I have filed a bill that would eliminate every single high-stakes standardized test that's not required by the feds. And I would get rid of those too, except I don't have the power to do so. So at least at the state level, we're trying to do that. Second thing, just as a follow-up, was what we made earlier, that the stress is real. I appreciate the data on the stress, the mental health, that is helpful to me in my fight here in the Senate. But we mentioned specifically the cost of tuition. Please help me get the word out that the fault is our fault. The fault is not your university's fault. We talk about the increase since the 1980s in college tuition. There's a coincidental number. Is in the 1980s, we, the state, used to fund on average 40% of all the operations of your colleges and universities. Today, we fund next to 5 to 8% of your colleges and universities. So you just think about it, as if in the 80s we funded 40% of everything you do, and today we fund 5%, whatever you do, then the only thing you can do is increase tuition. And so I remind folks all the time that we, General Assembly, can't point fingers at you without having 3 fingers pointed back at us, because we've drastically cut funding in South Carolina. The tuition is highest. Best example in the world is in the 14 states in the Southeast. North Carolina has the lowest in-state tuition of any state. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but they also have the highest funding by their legislature. South Carolina, on the flip side, has the highest tuition of the 14 states in the Southeast. And coincidentally, South Carolina is also, we fund our colleges the least of all the 14 states. And so it's simple math. If the state would increase its funding, then colleges could lower their tuition. One thing I'll talk about in a minute, but one piece of good news is in this year's budget, we have included the amount of money on the line. We just passed it just a few minutes ago that would mitigate any need for a tuition increase. And when I say that, is whatever the tuition increase would cost your university, we're putting in the budget to give to you so you don't have to increase tuition. And so that was one win that was in the budget. Please hang on to that win, because most of what I share, you'll wish you could remember what that win was. But we'll jump in first. This year, South Carolina has more new dollars than at any time in the history of the state of South Carolina. This year in our budget, we have more new dollars at one time than we will probably ever have again in the budget. And it's not just because of the COVID dollars, but because South Carolina, as many of you know on this call, since we never shut down really as a state, our economy is stronger than anyone in any state in the country. And we have revenue rolling in like we've never seen before. Our traditional budget is about a $9 billion budget. This year, it's $16 billion. Very odd to have a $7 billion increase in 1 year for a budget that ain't but $9 billion as well. So that's the good news. The bad news is you would think this would be the year for public education in South Carolina. This is the year we screw public education in South Carolina. And so education got very little of that, even though the feds required that they did. The good and the bad, probably that was the most eye-catching in this year's budget, that again, taking the budget from the House and then what the Senate has been working on the last 3 days, and we just finished an hour ago. The good was the tuition mitigation. This is the monies that will keep your university from having to increase tuition next year by making sure we pay that exact amount. So you're still getting the money you need, but you're getting it from us rather than students, which also ought to help on a small amount with the stress. The bad news is, if you have not heard, and I know this doesn't directly impact higher ed, but I think it would at least tangentially, is we have abolished funding for dual credit in South Carolina. There will be no more state funding for dual credit courses in South Carolina. That doesn't mean you couldn't try to take one if you were a rich parent and you had a whole bunch of money. But as many of you know, and many of you have worked well to try to accommodate kids that while they were in high school earned certain numbers of units for college credit. You've worked with those folks to get them in. It's helped some with that cost of college education that was referenced earlier in the mental health stress portion of today's presentation. But we have had a waiting for years and years and years in our state budget that gave money to school districts to be able to pay for dual credit courses, allowing kids to earn college credit while they're in high school. And that was abolished. We've also drastically cut, I know this doesn't impact you as much, but we've also drastically cut vocational courses, the money for funding for those as well. And so in a year, we have more money than we've ever had to totally eliminate money for dual credit courses is a hard blow to working parents that have been trying to get their kids to take as many of those dual credit courses as they can. And a lot of the work that y'all have done to try to accommodate these students into universities was a great disappointment. I offered a series of amendments on Tuesday of this week to try to get that put back in, reminding them that they're going to have parents next year with kids that are going to be in seniors in high school. And there will now not be opportunities to do that unless you have in a wealthy school, if you have a critical number of wealthy parents that could guarantee the district that they'd be willing to pay for those courses, they'd be able to do that as well. So those are probably the good and bad of the budget. We had 100 amendments on our budget, and I'm not supposed to take questions, but I am going to ignore Kim and take a question here. I'll take a guess. 1/3 of the amendments had to do with two things. So please, somebody unmute yourself and see if you can guess. I will tell you, it's not anything we'll be proud of, but two things were almost half of the amendments. Somebody unmute and guess what you think we spent the majority of our time debating, or almost half the time debating.
Probably CRT.
Believe it or not, we're getting a bill on that next week. And so we will be on that much more than we want to, and we had a few amendments on it, but nope. You are on the right path.
I was going to guess something about LGBTQ issues.
Yes. So I say a third, almost a half of the amendments were either LGBTQ related issues, transgender issues. And I'll get you some examples because we passed some and you're going to need to know about it because they specifically impact higher ed as well. The other one, since you'll never guess, were popsicles. We had probably 23 amendments about popsicles. Evidently, and my wife laughed because she knew about them. I didn't know about them, but they're popsicles that have alcohol in them. I don't know what they are. The bill, mind you, if these budget amendments were to limit access around kids, I get it. We tried to ban them from entering the state of South Carolina. I offered an amendment to at least allow them in bars since we sell the alcohol. I won't spend any more time on it, but I would just tell you is you may hear some frustration in my voice because we literally spent almost half of our time debating transgender issues, most of them restricting access to the very counseling that's needed. And the other one is popsicles, frozen alcoholic popsicles. And so the transgender ones, some of them did pass. We passed a budget proviso that would limit access of transgender students to counseling. Please note that many of the stats that were shared in today's presentation, we mentioned, and we tried to, those of us on my side, tried to move the conversation away from transgender rights to suicide rates. And trying to make the case in point is why would we want to limit anyone's access to counseling, especially our transgender children? And so there were amendments regarding MUSC or counseling in general as well. And I'll get to Save Women's Sports in a little bit, but there were probably maybe 33 amendments regarding transgender and wanting to limit the ability of transgender students on colleges' campuses to be able to access medical services or counseling. And we unfortunately saw 2 of them pass. I don't know that we've got the votes to take them out in the House. Additionally, there were a couple CRT related. We had one amendment this morning. I was able to get it defeated, but it wanted to eliminate the word whole before child. There was an amendment that was having teachers making sure they teach the whole child, and we had probably an hour and a half debate about deleting the word whole before child because they believed that was connected to social and emotional learning. And in the CRT bill that passed the House, social emotional learning would be banned in South Carolina. So unfortunately, the year we have more money than we've ever had in the history of the state, and we will have any time soon. Not only do we not see additional monies going to public education, with the exception maybe of some tuition mitigation monies, we actually saw items cut in the education budget for dual credit courses, vocational courses. And we also saw some restrictions placed on what our colleges are able to do to meet the needs, in this case, of transgender students. And this is something that means, talking about advocacy, is we need to make sure that not only are we on this call talking to our local House members and senators, but that we are teaching our students and our faculty to begin realizing that I, as your senator, work for you. You need to be telling me real stories that exist on your college campuses. If you want to leave the names off, that's fine. But we were trying to humanize what was a very political fight on the floor. Getting to CRT, we didn't have as much of that in the budget. But as many of you know, the House has spent the majority of the session on a bill to ban critical race theory, a theory that, by the way, is not really taught in our third grade social studies classrooms, but has been broadened in scope to banning the use of the word slavery below a single age, determining what types of history can be taught, determine whether or not critical events, current events can even be taught in certain situations, and defining what the truth is. And so we probably had 7 hearings over there in the House. I will tell you that folks on my side offered almost 900 amendments to the bill, allowing the points to be made and trying to stop it. They eventually didn't stop it. It has now made it to the Senate. And fortunately, we only have 6 days left in the session. My goal is to dance and sing and whatever I can do to run the clock out on these 6 days, because I don't have the votes to defeat it. But this critical race theory bill would define not only what the truth is that can be taught, but it would really use an intimidation tactic to scare our teachers to even mention truth that has occurred in our nation's history because of comfort levels of our students. And please know that this critical race theory bill goes way beyond what you might think in your wildest dreams to become. It deals with when students might be uncomfortable. We had a House member say that their grandchild, the reason he supported the bill was that the grandchild came in one day and was talking about something that they learned in the civil rights movement. And it was a Ruby Bridges lesson that was gone that day, and asked her granddad, well, what did you do since you were alive in there to stop it? And he said it made him feel uncomfortable. Now, I responded that maybe it should have made him feel uncomfortable. But the point being is either Ruby Bridges either happened or it didn't happen. But this will greatly restrict it. But more importantly to me, if you're talking about a young 21-year-old white female middle-class teacher going into a new setting, you're now intimidating a teacher to talk about anything at all because they're scared of what might be considered critical race theory, or a principal that is being maybe evaluated by their superintendent, just telling their teachers, look, just stay away from everything because I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. We do believe many of the last few days of the session we're going to be taken up on critical race theory. And also, please note that part of this, several things. One is teachers would have to give their lesson plans for every single day for the entire year up front and publicize an outline with resources on the website, allowing parents to be able to follow along and object to criteria as the years go by. But it also would ban any mention of social emotional learning or any counseling in the area of social emotional learning as a part of that. 6 days left in the session. I am prayerful that if anything, I can just talk as long as I'm talking to you right now. We run the clock out on that. Sorry, I'll move quicker. Just going down my list. One, I guess a positive thing. Was that a question?
I was just gonna say, so this hasn't fully gone through yet.
No, so it has passed the House. It is now in the Senate, and they have the votes to pass it. No two ways about it. The only thing I got on my side is we've got 6 days left, and there are some other bills that they also want. And hearing me talk for a long time on it, which would keep them from getting to the other bills, might help us maybe not get to it till the last day, and maybe I could filibuster it then. But
If we were to send out action alerts, though, that were to be sent
very much so
in the next couple of days.
No, yes. Yep. Yes, absolutely. In terms of timing for advocacy, the bill is in the Senate now, and you know, whatever the theme is, I have been saying, you know, nothing but the truth has been my theme. Is that if something's true, I'm a former history teacher, and if it was true, I taught it. If it wasn't true, I didn't teach it. And we don't need a critical race theory bill to try to redefine what truth happened and what version of truth happened. And so, yes, the timing is good on that.
And this curriculum for you would only apply to public schools, not to private schools, or all?
It would only apply to public schools. But you can't say it would only apply to schools that receive public dollars, because I'll get to it in a second. We have also passed a bill that will send $100 million of your taxpayer money that we're taking from public schools to send them to private schools, who would not have to adhere to that. They can do whatever they want with the money that we will no longer have because they're going to private schools. But I'll come back to that one in a second. Still sticking in the budget, one thing regarding testing that we did get in is it was the only one we were able to get in. We were able to get a pilot. And so, David, this goes to your point. It's not as a complete of a testing item as you want, but the Praxis 1 test, which is kind of that entry test to become a teacher that is taken by college students in teacher education programs. We were able to establish a pilot program where 5 universities could volunteer to participate, and they would eliminate the need for the students to have to take the Praxis 1 test. Trust me, I tried a whole lot, but the only thing I can get is Praxis 1. But that is one that we think will pass through the House as well. 3 more I want to go, and then I'll take questions. Next week on Tuesday, when we finished the budget today, we were all getting ready to go home. And right before we left, they voted to set a bill to special order. And when they vote to set a bill to special order, what that means is we can't do anything else until we finish that bill. And so, does anyone want to take a guess what the bill they set to special order on Tuesday will be? Because it will impact you as well. Or at least
state
the university.
Salaries.
Say again?
State salaries.
Oh, that would be a good one. No, absolutely. Save women's sports, and basically another transgender bill to put these transgender people back in their place with no counseling, of course. But the Save Women's Sports transgender bill will be set up for debate on Tuesday, and we'll go who knows how long on that. And it just shows kind of the priorities, sadly, we have in the state of South Carolina. I'll end with 2 quick things, and then I'll take whatever questions you have. The other 2 things I do want to share that we did deal with is in South Carolina. One, I've already mentioned the eliminations of the weightings for dual credit courses and the funding for vocational courses. The other one, and it's not directly you, but I want you to know this, is South Carolina, our public school teachers are paid 50th in the country. Now, many of you aren't social studies teachers. I am a social studies teacher. Hopefully, you know there are only 50 states. And so that means we rank rarely low on that. We have more money than we've ever had in the history of the state of South Carolina. And guess how much we've guaranteed every teacher in the state a raise? That would be $0. We are giving some money to districts and some more money to other districts and some less money to other districts, and districts will be left on their own to see what kind of raises they could put together. We've never done this before. Even last year, we were able to fund a $1,000 raise that would have moved us from 50th to 48th in the country, and we did it. The problem is those other 2 states gave a $1,500 and $2,000 raise, and we ended up in 50th again. But usually in the past, we give every teacher in the state a 3% raise or a $1,000 raise because we're trying to create supply, right? We're adding to the supply. This year, we didn't do that. South Carolina teachers on average are paid $4,000 less than North Carolina, $7,200 less than Georgia. Last week, Mississippi, yes, I said that, freaking Mississippi, thank God for Mississippi, passed a $4,725 raise for teachers. Zero. Alabama, not necessarily the liberal bastion of California, New York, and Chicago. Alabama, a 4% teacher raise. Zero. Last thing I'll get to, I referenced it before. While we didn't fund our schools, while we didn't really fund some needed programs and counseling, we did fund $100 million that we're taking from public schools, sending it to private schools with little to no accountability. You're familiar with what voucher programs are, is that the kid would get a voucher for $6,000. And so we're talking about less than 0.5% of the population of the state would likely be able to take advantage of these. And then they take their $6,000 to their private school that costs $21,000. And then, of course, they pay the difference because all poor families can afford to come up with $14,000 to pay a private school to go with a $6,000 voucher. And they go there. There are no requirements that private schools take anyone at all. I'll share one amendment, then I'm going to shut up and take your questions. I offered 75 amendments, but the one amendment I thought I had a chance of passing was if a special needs child that had a disability, and you could qualify for the scholarship, for the voucher, for all these criteria, one of which was having a disability, is if the special needs kid with a disability took their government voucher paid for by tax dollars to a private school, the private school should not be allowed to deny entrance solely based on their disability. Now, if they couldn't do something else, fine, but you couldn't say, you can't walk, we're not taking you in. My amendment failed. And so private schools, we know, are already denying based on race and all these other things. But now the private schools with this will be able to deny special needs disabled children who are holding a government voucher and deny them admission into their private school based solely on their disability. And one last thing, our state constitution says, and I hope you catch the irony here, our state constitution says the state of South Carolina shall give no public money to any private religious or non-religious K-12 school. So anyway, I'll stop there, Kim. I probably went beyond my time, but I would be glad to take any questions at all. I'm a little punch happy since we worked from 8 in the morning till midnight. My truck broke down on the way home, so I was hitchhiking on the way home last night at midnight. But I'd be glad to entertain any questions that we may have. I need your help. I'm so glad to be on a call with folks that value public education and at the higher ed levels that believe in advocacy, because we don't have the votes right now, and I need your help with advocacy. Any questions?
So one question that I have, and I'm the Dean of Admission for the College of Charleston. So if we're not— And
by the way, let me interrupt. College of Charleston has the lowest amount of state support of any state-supported college in the state of South Carolina. We screwed you more than any other college in the state. Go ahead.
Very aware, intimately attached to the budget on a daily basis. But my question is, so if there's no more state funding for dual credit and vocational courses have also been cut, with the legislature having approved the bill where our public schools have to accept 60 credit hours or more of in-state students transferring into your institution, how is that really going to work out?
Well, two things. The bill doesn't ban dual credit. It just doesn't fund it. So I don't want to pick on, well, Fort Mill is in my area, so I'll pick on Fort Mill. If I'm in Fort Mill and I got tons of parents that got money, then the parents that got money can say, well, we'll all pay the tuition ourselves. And that'll be a critical mass so that York Tech can continue to offer the dual credit course. You see where I'm going here? So, and then you still have AP courses as well. So going back to David's equity argument is you'll still have people taking dual credit courses, because if you have a high concentration number of wealthy parents that are willing to spend the money, then they can pay for that directly to York Tech and get the course and whatnot. But if you live in a poorer community, even if you are wealthy, let's say we have in Chester, we have some wealthy folks that want to pay. But if there's not enough of them to have a course every year, even if they wanted to pay, a university is not going to partner, a technical college is not going to partner to offer those. So to answer your question, the provision is still there. People will still be able to earn college credit while they're in high school and transfer it in. The numbers doing it will drop unbelievably drastically because we're not paying for it anymore. And you certainly will have compounded by a million your equity concerns. Does that answer your question?
It does. And that was the point I was trying to get to, towards the end, since the majority of transfer students typically tend to be from marginalized and underrepresented communities and backgrounds. And, I think my concern as a professional is with the state of South Carolina being predominantly rural. This is a state that is trying to better its workforce to prepare for the careers and industries that are coming in, to cut vocational funding and to change some of this interest in dual credit. It doesn't seem to be in tandem with supporting a job for, a workforce that can accommodate that need.
You are 100% correct. I didn't mean to shut you off. The other answer is we suck, was the other answer to your question. Is you're right. And I made the points on the floor. The example I like to use, because, we have tons of examples of dual credit. We got tons of examples of vocational career. But up in my neck of the woods, York Tech has worked with several of our electric utilities, York Electric Co-op, Duke Power, to offer lineman training. And so with York Tech is working with them, and they offer training in the career centers, vocational courses, that also is dual credit at York Tech. And these kids pass the certification test to become a lineman. And forgive me for this, because they're not necessarily going to Winthrop the next year, College Charleston, but it's still a good example of our point. But they're going to have all their certifications before they even graduate from high school. At the graduation ceremony last week, which is before the high school graduation, half of them got offered jobs on the spot at 18 years old. And we're going to cut the entire program because it's funded by two things: dual credit and vocational ed. So I made the case on the floor, and I don't know that folks care, which is why advocacy is so important. We need to humanize those stories. We need to let them know who is in their community and what they look like and what we're doing for those and who's going to be hurt from that. Because I don't care if you are a white Republican from the upstate or an African-American Democrat from the low country, you're going to have kids that their parents need them to be taking dual credit courses for whatever reason, or vocational ed courses, those types of things. So the short answer to your question is we suck. And I should have given you that. You bring up an excellent point. Other questions or excellent points showing us how we suck? I'll take any of those.
I'm actually just curious of the rationale they're using to cut the funding of vocational learning and dual enrollment.
Yeah, I beat that drum Tuesday until the chairman of Senate Finance finally sat me down. I challenged them. I said, you talk with your local businesses, talk with your local chambers of commerce. You don't need to talk to universities, whatever. Talk to your local business folks that are saying we need folks, in addition to folks going to college. Remember, y'all on this call hear it all the time, don't you? We're over promoting colleges. We need people to go straight to the workforce. And so the very people telling us that are now cutting the funding of being able to get the people prepared to go into the workforce. Fairfield schools were working with Dominion, used to be SCANA, to prepare people to go into work at our nuclear site right across the way, and to gut the funding while our own businesses are screaming out for workers. Don't y'all keep hearing all the time, we over promote college because welders can earn $80 million a year, whatever. And it's true. I mean, there's some truth to that. But for the people that are the ones saying it, being the very ones wanting to cut the funding to get our kids trained to that when their businesses are asking for it, I don't get it. I for the life of me, I don't get it. Especially, to answer your question, Fred, I'll go a step further. We're cutting this money in the year we have the most new money ever. And so my point on the floor was, if we're in a budget crisis and we have to make some tough decisions, and occasionally we make a bad decision, and this is one of them, I get it. But when we have more new money than we've ever had in the history of the world, and we're cutting something? I wish I had a good answer. Trust me, I asked the question until they started wanting to throw things at me on the floor.
Oh my goodness. This is really, really great information, Mike. I'm trying to pick my jaw up off the floor, to be honest with you. But this is incredible. And this is, just to reiterate your point as well, this is why we advocate.
Yes.
Mike is a one-man army. And I believe he told me in the past as well that you're actually the only senator who has a background in education right now.
Yes.
So this is crucially important. It's something that not only affects all of our students, but in the long haul, for those of us who have children, for those of us who are planning to have children and remain in South Carolina, these are all things that are going to affect us at one point or another. So definitely let's put out those action alerts. David, I will be in contact to make sure that we're getting those done.
And Kim, before you make me say goodbye, let me throw one thing in. I know Kim will thank me for being on the call today. I need y'all to know I was looking forward to y'all all week, because remember, the entire week up until about an hour ago, I've been on the floor with people that wanted to talk popsicles and transgender and cutting education. Please know, getting to be on the phone with educators talking about advocacy, you are blessing my heart today after being in hell with Satan. I didn't say that. I'm sorry. Being in a rough situation. So I appreciate each one of you. I do challenge you, though. I know we say I don't do this for politics. I'm not in this for politics. Please consider at least 5% of your mission, of the life that you're giving. I know David preaches this all the time. We got to tell our story, and we got to humanize our story. And so even if it's like the access, denying access to transgender students to counseling or whatever, we need to tell the story about kids and the fact that we have real life human beings that have stress and might commit suicide, and telling that story to make sure we don't make political red versus blue, Democrat versus Republican fights and bring those into our classrooms. So please, thank you for your passion. Please encourage your colleagues to be advocating and helping tell the story of the successes we're doing and telling us, please don't cut those, but also the needs we have. I appreciate each one of you. Thank you, Kim.
I could have said it. Yes, I don't think I could have said it better myself. In truth, I think that is an excellent way to close. So thank you so much, Mike, and thank you everyone who has attended today. We will be in touch in regards to those action alerts. If there's anything that you need from myself, any questions, additional questions that you may have for our panelists, I'm happy to send out their contact information as well if it's not already in the chat. But for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and conclude. I appreciate everyone once again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. All right, bye-bye.